If a student today should ask what creates the force of electricity, his teacher will reply, photons. The student may be satisfied, but in fact, no explanation has been provided. There is something about having a label for things which makes most people feel that they understand, even when they don't. Milo Wolf. So then, following the sentiment expressed in Milo Wolf's quote, what actually is a photon? In other words, rather than simply assign a label, how can we truly understand the nature of that which reality, fundamentally, appears to be made of? Within the context of the modern scientific approach, answering questions about the nature of reality involves describing the structure of what we are able to observe, and according to contemporary scientific consensus, we are able to describe this structure fairly well. Current consensus is that the photon is both a wave and a particle, and that it arises as an excitation of a fundamental field. Possibly more fundamentally, a photon may be a vibrating string existing as part of a multidimensional manifold that forms the basis for any and all wave particles. In any case, while answers like this are certainly profound in their own right, they do not really deal with the essence of the question. To truly address this question, rather than describe the structure that it is in, i.e. the wave particles, fields, or strings, we must examine the nature of the fundamental substance making up any and all structure, what the substance of the photon actually is. In order to begin to understand how to address this question, and to eventually comprehend its significance, let us first examine the nature of the modern approach to understanding reality. The scientific method, as our middle school textbooks first attempted to explain to many of us, forms the basis for the modern approach. In essence, this method is very simple. Have an idea, test this idea, obtain your results, and perhaps most importantly, be willing to accept that your original idea may be wrong. If and when you realize your original idea was incorrect, then let go of the assumptions, biases, or prejudiced beliefs which may have been exposed in the process. In principle, I'm in complete agreement with this methodology. However, in terms of conventional scientific thinking and practice, I would argue that this method is still influenced by the biases, beliefs, and assumptions of the people employing it, and that these prejudices are more deeply rooted than they realize. Because of this, the worldview and conceptualization of reality that conventional scientific thinking typically engenders is quite incomplete. Modern academic physicists, who might not have the time or patience for such abstractions, would probably tell you that their realm of study doesn't really provide a way to answer the question of what a photon is. Instead, they might say, physics provides a way to answer the question of how photons look and behave based on our ability to observe and interact with them in an objective way. In other words, it isn't really possible to know what a photon is in terms of the nature of the substance itself, but only that it is possible to observe it behaving in a wave particle, field-like, etc. way. As Niels Bohr himself said, it is wrong to think that the task of physics is to find out how nature is. Physics concerns what we say about nature. Modern physicists might suggest that the question of what a photon is be left to philosophy. The methodology of modern Western philosophy concerns itself with refining our ability to think about things. As the scientific method applies to objective reality, the philosophical method applies to our subjective reasoning, and it is designed to help us remove the assumptions, the prejudices, and the fallacies that influence our attempts to understand the world. Through reasoning alone, modern philosophy seeks to accomplish the goal of coming as close as possible to something that is irreducibly true. Our ability to reason is governed by our intellect, and thus, if objectivity is an implicit requirement of the modern scientific method, then intellectual ability is the implicit requirement of modern philosophical inquiry. I completely agree with the notion that the intellect is a valuable tool for helping us to understand the big questions, but as in the case of the scientific method, in conventional practice, the biases and the beliefs of modern philosophers tend to influence and produce a worldview that falls short of reality as well. In terms of what a photon is, philosophy does have a distinct area of study that deals with questions like this one, ontology, which is the philosophical inquiry into the nature of existence itself. In this case, the ontological concept that might be applied best here is substance theory. The early modern Western philosophers investigating these concepts determined that there were three possibilities concerning the nature of things and the substance things are made out of. It is ultimately mind, ultimately matter, or ultimately God substance, which the Greeks also referred to as pneuma, meaning breath. Each of these was understood to be somehow distinct from one another, and these three basic ideas haven't really changed since then. The problem is that even though these early European thinkers were able to assign name to what they perceived to be the fundamental constituents of reality, the essence of the original question still remains to be satisfactorily dealt with. The same question could be asked of each of these three things. What is the matter substance, for example, which is simply a rephrasing of my original question. Both modern philosophical reasoning and modern scientific study leave us wondering what a photon ultimately is. If Niels Bohr said that physics is only what we say about nature, then there may as well have been a modern philosopher who said something similar. That philosophy is our attempt at refining our ability to know something about nature, not about finding out how nature actually is. Modern philosophy, apparently, has also fallen short of finding a way to address fundamental questions about reality in a way that suits the needs of the modern scientific worldview, and as a result, modern science sometimes regards philosophical inquiry with contempt. As Stephen Hawking once said, "Philosophy is dead. Philosophers have not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly physics." In a sense, I agree. However, the science that Hawking is referring to, as I have stated, has the same ultimate problem. We now have mobile phones, for example, but the fact that we have them does not really make up for the fact that we do not, when we really get down to it, actually know what they are. It is not that philosophy hasn't kept up, it's that the problems of modern and pre-modern philosophy are older and apparently still just as difficult to answer. In any case, the problem of the original question, what the photon actually is, remains. The fact that this question creates a problem for both modern science and philosophy can be traced back to the fundamental basis that each discipline rests upon. Science, as it exists in its modern form, is an exercise in pure objectivity, in the sense of being separate or disengaged from that which is being studied. Philosophy, as it exists in its modern form, is a purely intellectual endeavor which seeks to perfect our ability to apply reason to any and all difficult problems. Both of these disciplines are apparently lacking in their ability to conceptually penetrate reality at its fundamental level. This is because objectivity does not deal directly with reality. This is because our intellects do not deal directly with reality either. Objectivity and intellect deal with reality in a second-hand sort of way. They allow us to objectively describe the characteristics of something, it's a wave, particle, field, or string, for the purposes of refining our intellectual manipulation of the concepts involved, but they do not allow for direct conceptual interaction with what that thing, the mind, the matter, or the God substance, actually is. They allow for indirect description, but not true definition. True definition, and thus true understanding, exists beyond the scope of these methodologies as they exist in their modern forms. That objectivity is the only and correct method with which to approach reality is an assumption. That our intellects are the only and correct tool at our disposal is also an assumption. I would argue that a third commonly held assumption is that questions that point to mysteries that fall outside of the jurisdiction of an intellectually objective worldview aren't actually meaningful because nothing useful can come from asking them. All three of these assumptions are generated by, and they return us to, the same intellectually objective, conventionally materialist worldview. To those of us that developed within cultures that espouse this worldview, the question of what photons, fields, or strings actually are may very well seem pointless to ask, because the very methods that we have been taught to use do not contain within them a way to answer them. Not that they don't have an answer yet, but rather that they possess no way to find the answer, let alone deal with the implications of what this answer might be. With respect to the fundamental nature of reality, they create a feedback loop of ignorance. For all conceivable intents and purposes that are formed within the context of this intellectually objective worldview, the ability to objectively describe and manipulate matter is all that there needs to be. Who cares about trying to know what the substance of the wave particle is, since it's apparently impossible to intellectually describe, and especially if that process doesn't allow you to do anything new? I still have my mobile phone, right? The desire to find a way to solve any problem we encounter, in whatever context, is one of the fundamental tendencies that informs our behavior as consciously aware beings. And yet it seems that the very tools we have been given to help us understand reality are themselves incapable of ultimately penetrating it. The main theme of Albrecht Dürer's Melancholia is to capture this frustration. We can see all the tools at the disposal of the modern philosopher-scientist's feet, and yet despite employing them all, his true goal remains out of reach, as it apparently still is 500 years and many technological advancements later. As you can imagine, this realization may inspire a feeling of melancholy in any modern scientist or philosopher, eager to prove the old masters wrong with how quickly modern thinking can break the riddle of reality. The real point of investigating a question such as what a photon is lies in understanding what it reveals to us about the intellectually objective method and worldview. If the methods of intellectual objectivity ultimately fall short of reality, and we desire to overcome this problem, we must consider another method. If you cannot conceive of what another valid method of investigating reality could even be, this is the result of how we, living in cultures espousing an intellectually objective worldview, have been taught to think. You cannot ultimately know what wave particle stuff is, objectively or intellectually, but this fact does give you a hint about how to go about the process of understanding its true nature, and it gives you a hint as to what you are actually able to do in order to pursue this understanding. The question of what a photon is very much like a Zen koan. I fully agree with you about the significance and educational value of methodology as well as history and philosophy of science. So many people today, and even professional scientists, seem to me like somebody who has seen thousands of trees but never seen a forest. This independence created by philosophical insight is, in my opinion, the mark of distinction between a mere artisan or specialist and a real seeker after truth. Albert Einstein. So that was the first chapter in a book I've been trying to write for kind of a while. And it came from a sort of central question I asked myself when I was first beginning to proactively pursue my own sort of spirituality and investigate what conscious awareness was for myself. And that central question kind of was, at what point does matter stop being matter and like start being spirit? But of course, eventually the answer came like, there's no point at which one thing starts being something and stops being another thing. It's all the same thing. I think a simple analogy would be like how water in the state of ice, liquid water, and then air or water vapor is the same thing. It's just in a different state. So this sort of material experience is a state of spirit. And when you begin to investigate your own conscious awareness and how it connects you to what reality is, and the abilities and experiences you can connect to as a result of that investigation, you can get a better understanding for how that all works and what spirit even is. But the knowing of what it is comes in the direct experience of what it is. Until then, you can only really rely on sort of indirect description, utilizing the sort of mental tool of the intellect, which is another reason I wanted to write this book, because I see, and there always has existed, that sort of impenetrable barrier of the inability to intellectually describe things that sort of fall beyond or outside of the jurisdiction of the abilities of the intellect itself. There seems to be an increasing sense that modern philosophy is sort of aware of the fact that something strange is going on with reality, which is why the big question of the relationship between matter and consciousness is raised more and more, it seems like. But it's kind of like modern philosophy and in some ways modern science have led themselves to the water, but they don't know how to drink. Intellectually objective methodology and language is what creates the fundamental problem of definition itself. As long as the assumption that this kind of methodology is the only valid method of inquiry, modern science and philosophy will continue to be stuck between a rock and a hard place, unable to sort of conceptually penetrate reality on a fundamental level, and unable to formulate a method by which this paradox can be resolved. The so-called hard problem of consciousness is only hard because the methodology of modern science and philosophy introduces and perpetuates that hardness. When the sort of unstoppable force of intellectually objective methods meet the immovable object of the sort of fundamental strangeness of consciousness and reality, something has to give. And as Niels Bohr, one of these sort of founding fathers of modern physics, said, how wonderful that we have met with a paradox. Now we have some hope of making progress. In reality, there is no hardness to the problem. There is no paradox in reality, but only within our conceptualizations of reality that are formed within a context of ignorance, and an ignorance that is perpetuated by an incomplete methodology of investigation. Until a self-led, qualitative, introspective investigation into the nature of our own consciousness and its relationship to the reality we experience, aka spirituality, is reincorporated into the modern approach, that approach will always fall short of reality. A Zen koan, in terms of its original purpose, is very similar to a paradox. It's meant to sort of exhaust the intellectual faculties so that in the phenomenological space, previously occupied by the machinations of the intellect, you have the ability to become aware of the other mental phenomena you actually have access to, and what they can reveal to you about the nature of self, consciousness being the origin and basis of self, and reality. In other words, as Lao Tzu said, stop thinking and end your problems, because it is the consciousness that precedes the act of thinking that is the important part of the investigation. And that doesn't mean investigating reality in a traditional scientific way isn't important, but until the other important part, the consciousness that is doing the investigating, is reincorporated into that methodology, then the problem and the paradox will always be introduced. So that's really the point of the first part of this book, to explain spirituality within the context of the modern sort of understanding of reality that we all live in, and how spirituality is the basis for a complete understanding of that reality. And then the book gets deeper from there. I go into more spiritually based topics rather than the dense philosophical stuff that I speak about at the beginning. And let me say this, understanding the sort of lofty modern philosophy and physics concepts is really not necessary to begin spiritually developing or begin exploring your own experience of consciousness. Complexity does not automatically equal profoundness or importance, and I'm trying to include everything that I can think of for anyone coming out of this context from the intellectually objective modern approach, who is beginning to understand their own spirituality, including as many of the sort of standard big questions that I can think of that we all have, that all conscious beings have, and answer them based on my own understanding and experience. The desire to know who and what we are and where we come from is one that is innate to the conscious awareness of human beings, and that desire is present for a reason. So anyway, in conclusion, the hard problem of consciousness is a paradox. And paradoxes are catalysts for deeper understandings of reality itself. And reality itself is spiritual in nature. The words of truth are always paradoxical. Lao Tzu. Everything is dual. Everything has poles. Everything has its pair of opposites. Like and unlike are the same. Opposites are identical in nature, but different in degree. Extremes meet. All truths are but half-truths. All paradoxes may be reconciled. The Kybalion. How wonderful that we have met with a paradox. Now we have some hope of making progress. Niels Bohr.